Boeing, a company that cannot stop being in the headlines for all the wrong reasons.
Amid new problems with Boeing's 737 MAX.
Nightmare scenario for passengers. The clothes on one child sucked out.
Where was the oversight to make sure the most critical pieces were there?
It was once known for great engineering and the most advanced planes like the 737s. It dominated the industry so much that slogans like, "If it's not Boeing, I ain't going," were popular. But today, it's a completely different story. Something terrible is happening at Boeing. Its planes are crashing, whistleblowers exposing the company are dying left and right, investors are losing confidence, and now people have started saying, "If it's Boeing, I ain't going." No, seriously, this is not even an exaggeration. People are not just a little anxious about flying on Boeing planes, they are terrified. Every other day, you hear news of Boeing's aircraft making an emergency landing because of some issue. It's gotten to the point where AlternativeAirlines.com has a whole page dedicated to giving you information about which airlines in the world are not flying Boeing 737 MAX, so that you can actively avoid the airlines that are. Recent polling by Redfield and Wilton Strategies for Newsweek suggests that as an aftermath of the Boeing debacle, Americans are now more worried about flying. Boeing has dominated the aerospace industry for decades now. It, along with Airbus, controls almost the entire commercial airplane market, but it might not last long. So what made the company so successful, and is it heading towards an imminent downfall? We will talk about it all in this video. Stay tuned. To know why the company is so successful and where it went wrong, you have to go back to its roots. Boeing was born out of a passion for aviation in William Boeing. William's love for aviation started sometime in 1909 when he saw an aircraft at the Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition in Seattle. William wanted to get a taste of flying, so he went to an air meet in Los Angeles. Sadly, no pilot was willing to let William on their plane. William was not about to give up on his dream of flying a plane. By 1915, he had started to take flying lessons and had even purchased his own private plane. You see, money was not an issue for William Boeing, as he came from a family of lumberjacks, and his family already had various businesses under their name. William felt like the private plane he bought had many flaws, like it was not stable, and it was making too much noise. His suspicion about the plane was right. Soon after voicing these concerns, the plane crashed during a test flight. Interestingly enough, rather than waiting months for the different parts of the plane to arrive and fix the plane, William decided to take matters into his own hands. He felt like, with his passion for aviation, he could make much better planes than anyone was making in the market at that time. He sure was right about that. So, the company we know now as Boeing was born. I am putting a lot of emphasis on William's passion for aviation here because this is what made the company so successful, and the lack of it is causing trouble for the company today. More of that later in the video. William founded Pacific Aero Products Company in Seattle, Washington in 1916. He renamed the company Boeing Airplane Company in 1917. Boeing saw its first financial success with its Boeing Model 2, designed by its first engineer, Wong Tsu. 1917 was also the year Boeing paved its path to dominate the aviation industry. On April 6, 1917, the U.S. declared war on Germany and entered World War I. The military needed planes, and Boeing had one of the best in the market. This started Boeing's close relationship with the military, which is still ongoing. Boeing first shipped 2 of their Model 2 planes to the Navy, and the Navy liked it so much that it ordered 50 more. I guess the planes were just that good. The company went from barely building planes to 50 in just a year, but Boeing was about to face its first setback. The Navy was their primary customer. The company had not diversified yet. The war ended in 1918, meaning the military no longer needed planes. The company had to cut down on production, so much so that the company stopped making planes at one point. Many aircraft companies went out of business during this time, but Boeing was determined to stay afloat. It did so by building and selling other various products like dressers, counters, and furniture. Eventually, they got back to making planes because that was what Boeing was best at. 1919 was the year the Boeing Model 6 flying boat made its first flight. With this plane, Boeing entered into the airmail business. For the next 8 years, Boeing focused on airmail flights. Now, in 1923, Boeing's relationship with the military resumed. The company started providing fighter jets for the U.S. Army Air Service. Over the course of the next decade, Boeing became the leading manufacturer of the fighters. In 1925, Boeing created an airline company. After the company's establishment, Boeing gradually acquired and merged with various other companies. You can see a pattern here. Throughout its history, Boeing has merged with or acquired its competitors. Remember that until 1928, Boeing was primarily an airmail company, and it worked with the military to provide them with aircraft. This changed when Boeing 80 made its first flight on July 27, 1928. It was the company's first plane, which was built with the sole intention of being a passenger plane. It could only accommodate 12 people. Makes you wonder how far aviation has come in less than a century, right? 80A, which made its first flight in September 1929, was the upgraded version of the 80, and it could accommodate 18 passengers. Boeing was already starting to become a dominant military manufacturer. It wanted to dominate the passenger side of the business as well. If you look at the history of aviation, Boeing has always been a visionary. In the early 1930s, Boeing was the leader in all-metal aircraft construction. These were well liked by the military, and in 1932, Boeing built the Model 248. This was the first all-metal monoplane fighter. The company was slowly incorporating its all-metal aircraft into the passenger transport market. Boeing 247 was introduced in 1933 and was so advanced that it set a standard for the whole industry. You see, the engines were quite unreliable in those days. And what did Boeing do? Builds the first twin-engine passenger aircraft that could fly only in one engine. This made the plane extremely safe as per the standards of that time. Not only was the new plane safer, it was much faster and easier to fly than other aircraft. William Boeing sold his shares and left the company in 1934. The company's new chairman, Claremont Claire L. Egtvet, believed that the company's future was in building bigger planes. So that is what the company started to work on. The company was focusing equally on manufacturing planes for the military and passenger transport. The long-range bombers were getting bigger and better every day, and so were the passenger planes. Boeing 314 Clipper made its first flight in June 1938. The plane was built for Pan American World Airways, Pan Am. This flying boat was the largest passenger-carrying aircraft of its time. It had a capacity of 90 passengers on day flights and 40 passengers on night flights. Just in a couple of years, Pan Am was flying its passengers worldwide on a Boeing 314. When World War II started, it was time for Boeing to shine again. The demand for the planes shot up. By the beginning of 1944, Boeing was making over 350 planes a month. Boeing made 98,965 for the U.S. military throughout the war. As a matter of fact, Boeing made the plane that was used to drop both atomic bombs in Japan. The war benefited the company and caused exponential growth, but more tough times were ahead. With the end of the war, their main source of revenue dried up once more. Most orders of bombers were canceled because the military had no use for them anymore. The company was in a very tough spot, and 70,000 people lost their jobs. By the mid-50s, technology had advanced, and by now, you already know Boeing is not a company that shies away from a challenge. They adopted these new technologies and saw it as an opportunity to develop and manufacture new products. The Cold War was in full swing. The military used these new technologies to the fullest. One of Boeing's first products with advanced technologies was a guided short-range missile to intercept enemy aircraft. Boeing has always played a crucial part in supplying infrastructure to the military. The 707, which went into commercial service in 1958, had 4 engines and could accommodate 156 passengers. The plane was a hit among the passengers. Boeing was now supplying passenger jets not only to the U.S., but also to airlines worldwide. In no time, it had become the leader in commercial jet manufacturing. Boeing was slowly getting back in the game, but they were unaware of the turmoil they were about to face. The recession of the 60s meant that fewer people were traveling. With no business, airlines stopped purchasing planes. The company's trouble did not end there. Military spending declined. Boeing also worked with NASA. and NASA was slowing down its space program because Project Apollo was about to be completed. This meant NASA was reducing its spending as well. Many of their streams of income were drying up again. Now, what is interesting is that the company was also facing financial trouble because of the production of its new 747. The company was $2 billion in debt. This nearly bankrupted the company, but Boeing persisted. The company was adamant about bringing the best product to the market. This is one of the reasons why Boeing has been so successful. The company was very product-driven. They did not care about the huge costs of building these products or the challenges they faced along the way. Boeing built the world's biggest factory to build the 747, and it paid off in more ways than the company could have imagined. 747 took Boeing to new heights. It changed the airline industry as a whole. The 747 could carry more passengers than any other airplane of that time. The plane helped Boeing establish a near monopoly in the market. To this day, Boeing has built and sold more than 1,500 747s. During the 80s, the economic situation improved, and Boeing dominated the market. However, with an increase in passengers, competition started to increase for Boeing. To this day, Airbus remains one of Boeing's biggest competitors. Boeing also contributed hugely to the space shuttle. It already had the expertise and experience from working in space rockets during the Apollo era. It also became one of the first contractors for the International Space Station program. 1994 would be the year Boeing would yet again outdo itself. Boeing 777 was introduced, the first airliner to be designed entirely using computer-aided design techniques or CAD. The plane had a seating capacity of about 300 passengers. Now, this period of Boeing's history is super important. When people think, when did things start to go wrong at Boeing, this is the period they often come back to. At the end of 1996, Boeing announced that it would acquire Rockwell's Aerospace and Defense units. Just 10 days later, it announced that it would be merging with McDonnell Douglas, which was completed in August 1997. Until 1997, Boeing was an engineer-run company. It was born out of the passion of William Boeing, and it continued to be run by people who knew what they were doing. Engineers had the final say. The company cared about what it was making, not how much money it was making. Cost-cutting to generate more profit was not an option. However, things slowly started to change at Boeing after the merger with McDonnell Douglas. The major change was that Philip M. Condit became the CEO of the company. Now, you might wonder why this is such a big deal. Remember how I talked about Boeing being run by engineers who were passionate about what they were doing at the company? Well, that was not the case anymore. Philip turned the company upside down. His motives? To make more money. The focus shifted from building the best, safest, and most innovative products in the market to reducing costs as much as possible and making the most profit. All the focus on building the planes was gone. Philip and his team made the decision to buy back Boeing stock for more than $10 billion. They have often been criticized for this move because that money could have been spent to build new airplanes or gone into research and development. The clash of corporate culture was also huge inside the company. William Boeing was very well known for often taking ideas and advice from his employees. That culture continued even after his departure. But with Philip in charge now, only the top management had a say on how things should be done or what was best for the company. The corporate culture in McDonnell Douglas dominated the one at Boeing. Engineers and employees often felt unheard. Another thing Philip did was he started outsourcing rather than doing all the work himself. This seemed like an efficient way to make aircraft, mainly because it reduced cost. In turn, it gave outsiders more responsibility in designing the integral parts of their products. All these would turn out to be costly mistakes on Boeing's part in years to come. The company did not know it yet, but the cost-cutting measures they had started adapting would stick, and in decades to come, cause irreparable damage to the company. But for the time being, it seemed like everything was working out in Boeing's favor. Boeing was leading the industry till 2002, but in 2003, it lost its lead in the airliner market to Airbus, which is the only competitor of Boeing. The company also had to cancel many projects. Boeing maintained a close relationship not only with the military, but also with NASA. In 2007, NASA selected the company to manufacture the liquid-fueled upper stage of the Ares war rocket. Boeing continued operating under its new management, focusing on cutting costs and increasing profits. Many accusations of unethical conduct arose in the company in 2003. This resulted in the resignation of Philip M. Condit. Around this time, the company was also accused of industrial espionage. The company was penalized and negotiated a settlement with the U.S. Department of Justice, which cost the company $500 million. In 2005, Jim McNerney became the CEO, and you guessed it right, he did not have any aerospace experience either. So the prioritization of a culture of profit maximizing persisted at Boeing. Over time, Boeing became increasingly dependent on suppliers to build its planes. The only thing Boeing did was join the parts together. Things seemed to be going really well for Boeing financially, but internally problems were starting to arise. The engineers building the planes were not satisfied with the planes. Any concerns that were raised were dismissed. As long as the planes were making money, it was okay. Because of a surge in demand for commercial aircraft, Boeing's revenue touched the $90 billion mark in 2014. Things were going really well for the company. The same year, NASA awarded contracts to Boeing and SpaceX to transport astronauts to the International Space Station. Boeing does not like to have much competition. That much is evident from its history. Boeing focuses a lot on lobbying. One example is the case with Bombardier Aerospace in 2016. Delta Airlines placed an order with this Canadian company, but Boeing was not happy about it. According to Boeing, the company was selling the planes at a much lower cost of $19.6 million each. According to Boeing, the plane cost $33.3 million to make. The company, as well as the government of Canada, denied the claims. Boeing has such influence that the lobbying worked. The final ruling was a total duty of 292%. According to the U.S. Department of Commerce, this was justified because of their America First policy. Bombardier was already facing financial issues, and with this debacle, the company was indirectly forced by U.S. government tariffs to sell 50% of its stake in the C-Series program to Airbus. Only if Boeing was putting this much effort into making its plane safe. Boeing had no idea what was coming for it. From the outside, Boeing was doing better than ever. In 2018, Boeing crossed the $100 billion revenue mark. It made $101 billion in revenue, its highest to date. Its stock price soared to $379, which was also the highest in Boeing's history. Boeing could do no wrong. However, unknown to people, Boeing's focus on safety was decreasing at an alarming pace. The company was obsessively focusing on increasing profit by any means. The employees were growing concerned over the top management's lack of care for safety. One of those employees was Pearson, an aviation safety advocate who has since testified against Boeing to Congress. According to him, there was evidence that the 737 MAX was having production quality issues, and that there were more than a dozen safety issues, some of which were serious. His recommendation to halt the production of the 737 MAX so that they could deal with the issues properly was dismissed by his boss. Frustrated with everything at the company, he left in 2018, just months before the first crash happened. Sooner or later, something disastrous was bound to happen, and the disaster struck. The first crash of the now infamous 737 MAX happened in October 2018 in Indonesia. The plane crashed after 13 minutes of takeoff, killing all 189 people aboard. Till now, Boeing had a perfect track record of having the safest planes in the industry, so people really did not think it was Boeing's fault. Capitalizing on the industry's trust in them, Boeing succeeded in keeping the planes on air. This turned out to be a fatal mistake on Boeing's side because it turned out the fault was in the planes. 5 months after the first crash, a MAX 8 crashed in March 2019, just 6 minutes after takeoff, killing all 157 people aboard. Now it was evident that something was seriously wrong with the planes Boeing was making, because 2 crashes in just 5 months could not have been a coincidence. This added to the continued scrutiny Boeing was already facing. Boeing got away with having to ground its planes the first time around, but this time, it would not be so lucky. The public was putting pressure on the FAA to ground the planes. Boeing tried to fight it, saying it had full confidence in the safety of the 737 MAX, but in the end, it had no other options but to ground the planes. Boeing did not know this, but this was just the start of the problems they would face in years to come. All the negligence and intense cost-cutting measures had finally caught up to Boeing. So, what caused the 2 crashes? Well, it was software failure, and Boeing was at fault for that. While the investigation started, Boeing told the investigators they were unaware of the safety issues before the crashes. The truth was bound to come out. Internal messages reveal that they were well aware of the problems. A top technical pilot complained about the system's erratic behavior as early as 2016. The executives at Boeing chose to ignore his complaints. Various internal documents show that the employees were not confident about the plane. The documents show one employee calling the 737 MAX ridiculous. Similarly, in another email, one employee admits he would not put his family in the MAX simulator-trained aircraft. The documents also reveal that the employee developing the software suggested that more training and guidance be given to the pilots to handle certain emergencies, but he was dismissed by the chief technical pilot, Mark Faulkner. According to Faulkner, if done so, the regulators would require the pilots to do more extensive training. This meant it would cost the company more. Ultimately, the software the employees warned the executives about played a key role in causing both crashes. Had they listened to the employees, the crashes could have been avoided. The planes were grounded for 20 months, and in 2019, Boeing reported a loss of $636 million. This was the company's first annual loss in more than 2 decades. While all this was happening, the public slowly lost its trust in Boeing. According to its own research, 40% of the travelers were unwilling to travel on the 737. Then, another disaster struck. The pandemic and the subsequent lockdowns drastically reduced air travel in 2020. The company laid off 12,000 of its staff in May 2020, and in October of the same year, another round of layoffs happened where 30,000 people lost their jobs. By July 2020, the company had already reported a loss of $2.4 billion. By 2021, the negligence had already cost Boeing more than $20 billion. It was considered one of the most expensive fiasco in corporate history. Boeing was having to pay everyone left and right. In September 2021, the Securities and Exchange Commission ordered Boeing to pay $200 million in fines for misleading the public. Boeing has consecutively suffered losses since 2019. Because of the disrupted supply chains during the pandemic, Boeing and its competitor Airbus face massive backlogs. It was not being able to supply its customers with planes. This started to cause problems for the customers as well. The situation got so bad that their customers threatened to cancel their orders if the delay continued. Things started to shimmer down, and it was looking like Boeing could go back to business in peace. But luck was not in Boeing's side. 2024 has not been Boeing's year. Things started to go south for the company at the beginning of 2024, and it has not stopped since. In January 2024, Alaska Airlines Flight 1282 was forced to return to Portland Airport for an emergency landing. The problem? The aircraft suddenly lost a door plug. The plane? Boeing 737 MAX 9. And just like that, Boeing was back in the headlines. Fortunately, no one was seated beside it, and no one was seriously injured. Passengers file a class action lawsuit against Boeing. The FAA orders the grounding and inspection of all 737 MAX 9's. Airlines report discovering loose hardware on the door plugs upon inspection. Boeing shareholders too filed a lawsuit alleging that the company misled them about its commitment to safety. The investigation continued, and it was found that 4 bolts were missing from the door plug. You would think Boeing would have learned its lesson by now after 2 fatal crashes, but I guess not. The FAA completed its audit and found many faults in manufacturing the 737 MAX jets. In February, another incident happened with United Airlines Flight 1539, a 737 MAX 8. In March, the news of Boeing whistleblower John Barnett's death made waves on social media. People could not stop talking about it. People grew more and more suspicious of Boeing. Some even went as far as to accuse Boeing of murdering the whistleblower. John Barnett retired in 2017 after working for the company for over 30 years. Days before his death, Barnett had given evidence in a whistleblower lawsuit against the company. According to reports, he died from a self-inflicted wound. He said he had found several issues and alerted the managers of his concern, but no action had been taken. A family friend claimed that he had previously told her, "If anything happens to me, it's not suicide." More whistleblowers have come forward with accusations of neglect from the company. They have also mentioned how their superiors tried to silence them when they voiced their concerns. But amidst all this, it's not only Boeing suffering, its customers are also suffering. According to United Airlines, it lost $200 million because of the grounding of the 737 MAX 9. after the door plug incident in January. Similarly, Alaska Airlines had an estimated loss of $150 million. With such frequent problems in its planes, Boeing has no other alternative but to compensate its airline customers for the loss they have incurred. According to Boeing, it will pay $443 million to its airline customers. Because Boeing cannot stop being in the headlines, even minor issues in Boeing planes are widely reported. It is almost as if we have news about a new day, new issues on Boeing planes almost every day. On April 23rd, Lufthansa Flight 456, a Boeing 747, had an issue with landing, which made news. On April 26th, Delta Airlines Flight 520, a Boeing 767, returned to John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York for an emergency landing about an hour after takeoff. Had these minor issues happened on an Airbus plane, people would not have batted an eye. But it's Boeing. It's almost like people have lost all their trust in Boeing. In May, another whistleblower dies, and it makes headlines again. Josh Dean worked as a quality auditor at the company and warned of flaws in the 737 MAX. He was said to have a healthy lifestyle and good health before suddenly falling ill and dying after being infected with influenza B and MRSA. The general public, shareholders, and the FAA grow more distrustful of the company. The incidents with the planes started to get worse as Boeing was under constant scrutiny. Another incident happened on May 8th in Istanbul. The front landing gear failed to deploy, and the plane, which was a Boeing 767 cargo plane operated by FedEx, was forced to make an emergency landing. Thankfully, there were no injuries. The very next day, on May 9th, a Corendon Airlines Boeing 737-800 had issues while landing at Turkey's Gazipaşa Airport. The aircraft was able to stop safely, and no one was injured. According to Turkey's transport ministry, the aircraft had problems with the front landing gear. Another incident happened the same day in Dakar, Senegal, where a passenger Boeing 737-300 skidded off the runway and caught fire. 10 passengers are injured, among which 6 have minor injuries while 4 have serious injuries. All flights are suspended at the airport. Boeing is now being investigated by the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission to determine whether the company misled investors about its safety practices. With how things are going right now, I do not think the SEC has positive to say about the company. On May 25th, less than an hour after taking off from Phoenix, a Boeing 737 MAX 8 jet experienced something called Dutch roll, in which the plane experiences uncontrolled side-to-side yawing motion. Interestingly, these kinds of motions are not very common in modern aircraft. The incident is being investigated by the FAA. Boeing sure is keeping the FAA occupied. Reports of problems with Boeing aircraft are coming from all around the world. Because of Boeing's current reputation, even minor issues are making headlines. Boeing reported a loss of $355 million in the first quarter of 2024. Its revenue fell 8% to $16.6 billion. Its total backlog grew to $529 billion, including over 5,600 commercial airplanes, per the company's report. Backlogs. Another thing that we cannot miss out on if we are talking about Boeing. According to the Flight Plan Forecast International, Boeing's backlog would last 11.9 years based on its 2023 deliveries. Airbus, on the other hand, is doing well compared to Boeing. Airbus is on its way to outdo itself in 2025 with the deliveries. Before this fiasco, Boeing had outdelivered Airbus every year since 2012. It is safe to say that its biggest competitor is catching up to Boeing. Boeing is not spared from constant criticism from the public for its close ties with the military. With the war ongoing between Israel and Hamas, Boeing has once again found itself in hot water. Students in the U.S. have protested that their universities should cut ties with the company. The extent of Boeing's involvement in arming the Israeli military is unknown, but it is a known fact that Boeing is a major supplier to the Israel Defense Forces, and has been since the very beginning. Once the most trusted name in the aviation industry with its innovation, engineering, and amazing products, it has now become a cautionary tale. Boeing's name came synonymously with safety. Maybe it was its too-big-to-fail mindset that landed Boeing in this predicament. To say the company is resilient would be an understatement. Over a century, the company has bounced back from many tough situations. We can only hope that Boeing learns from its mistakes, bounces back, and realizes that no company is truly too big to fail.